Okay, great. So the agenda for this session, we're going to just do a quick refresh of what we covered off in module 3, but the focus of this session is measuring. So we're going to talk about selecting your indicators, data collection methods, what we mean by a lean data approach, creating survey questions. So this module is all about gathering data, and the learning objectives of this module are understanding different data collection methodologies and the pros and cons of each, understanding what we mean by a lean data approach, understanding how to assess how robust data needs to be for a given purpose, and understanding the human elements of data collection. So making sure we consider things like accuracy and bias in the data collection and interpretation. So a quick recap, you're now all intimately familiar with the theory of change framework. Here's our nice simple theory of change that we've shown you lots of times, with the activity of the parenting program, working with parents and children so that parents can gain confidence in their parenting skills, leading to them spending more positive time with their children, reading to their children more, which is leading to increased cognitive development, and children arriving at school ready to learn. So we've talked about this framework, about the different heads of the framework, how you can make sure that there's a logic that links the activities to the impact that you want to have. And in the last session, we talked about how you can support a venture to develop their own theory of change, how you can facilitate a theory of change workshop and learn what all the outcomes are, and then put them in order, join them up, cluster them, and find that logic that is hidden within what the organization is doing that links it up to the impact that it wants to see. So now we're moving on to using that framework, that theory of change, as the base to be able to measure what you're doing. So the theory of change combined with indicators and some data collection methods puts you in a position where you can measure your impact. So the theory of change is the model that outlines the plan for what the organization is going to do and how that will lead to impact. In your framework, then you'll develop a measurement framework that includes indicators, which will let the organization measure if they're achieving their goals. And finally, the framework will include a plan for how the organization can collect, store, and analyze their data on those indicators. So I'll show you just a quick example. Don't worry if this is overwhelming, if there's too much in here, because we're going to talk through it in steps. The outcomes along the top there, you're very familiar with outcomes now. Outcomes are that some example ones that we've got here are that parents read to their children more. An indicator, which we'll talk about later, is a clue that that thing is happening. So the indicator for that outcome is the number of hours the parents spend reading to their children. The way we could collect that data is we could survey parents before and after the program, asking them, how many hours a day do you spend reading to your children? Next example we've got there is increased cognitive development. So the indicator is student performance in academic assessments. And the data collection could be collected from the school records system of their academic achievement. So that's a sort of a long-term outcome, and the organisation we worked with on this theory of change, they tested the increased cognitive development on, we have a test in New Zealand called the before school check. So children are checked at that point. So even though they're working with parents who may have pretty small children, they had to wait the 4 years before they could get that test done. So that's why they've got short-term measures and longer-term measures. And finally, the third outcome there, parents have increased confidence in their parenting skills. So that's an early stage outcome. The indicator for that could be that parents are sharing more stories about their parenting. We assume in that if they're sharing stories, they're feeling more confident. People are generally shy to share their experiences if they're less confident in the way that they're behaving. So if parents are sharing their stories, that is a clue to us that they're more confident in their parenting skills. So the way we can observe that, the way we can collect that data is through the staff observing those changes in the parents and recording the number of times the parents share stories of their experiences from home. So part one of this webinar, we're going to talk through choosing those indicators to measure. We've got the cycle here of the steps involved in adopting an outcomes-focused approach or an impact-focused approach. As you'll recall, right from the start, we talked about identifying the impact, identifying the good thing that you're trying to work on, partnering with the communities that you're seeking to support to learn from them what works best to achieve positive change, checking that evidence, seeing if there's anything anyone's done out there to address this problem in another way that you could learn from, and then developing and refining your theory of change. So that's the work that we've walked through to date. We've talked through all of that, and hopefully you're comfortable with developing a theory of change. The next stage on from that is identifying your indicators. So that's where it comes in the flow. And then you start to gather data, and then you analyze and report on it, and learn from it and amend your theory of change. So indicators, what is an indicator? An indicator is a clue or a suggestion that something has changed. It's a clue that you're having the impact that you're wanting to have in that outcome, and that change is actually happening. They're not necessarily proof that the change has happened. It could just be a clue that it's likely to have happened. So an example I sometimes use here is the example of the petrol gauge on your car, on your dashboard. You can look at that petrol gauge and it will tell you that the petrol tank is full. You don't need to stick your head in the petrol tank of the car to have a look and see that it's actually full for you to be fairly confident that the petrol tank is full. So if you were to stick your head in the petrol tank, that would be proof that it's full, you've seen it. But you don't need that, you just need the thing that gives you a clue that it's happening. So same with the parents reading to their children. You don't need to go home with them every night and sit with them to check that they're reading with their children. You've asked them the question and they've said, yes, we read to them approximately this number of hours per night. So that's your clue that it's happened. So we say that you should try and find an indicator or identify an indicator for every priority outcome within your theory of change. So remember, in the theory of change, we had the ones that were golden, the dark orange outcomes. Those are the outcomes that are the priority outcomes without which you wouldn't achieve your ultimate impact. So for each of those, if you miss one of those, it's hard for you to show the logic. So we say for every priority outcome, choose an indicator. There might be some other outcomes within your theory of change that you would choose to find an indicator for. Sometimes that happens if there's an outcome in your theory of change that's not vital for your golden thread, for your priority outcomes to get to your impact, but it's really important for another one of your stakeholders. So you might, for example, want to measure it so that you can report to a key funder that you're achieving employment outcomes because that's what they were interested in, even though employment isn't a core focus for you. So here on this slide, we've got the indicators from the golden thread. Hopefully you remember them from the theory of change that I've probably said to you 20 times now, and I'm sure you're all bored of. But they're the golden thread priority outcomes. And a couple of them were ones that I mentioned to you before. So parents are gaining confidence. An indicator for that is that parents share stories about their parenting. Parents spend more positive time with their children. The indicator is that parents share stories about their parenting. So there we've got the same indicator. We can be quite confident that that indicator is useful for both of those. Parents read to their children more. That one we need to actually have them tell us what they're doing. So the indicator is the number of hours parents read to their children. Increased cognitive development is the academic record, and children arrive at school ready to learn. There we've got that initial government test before beginning school. So those are the outcomes that have the arrows linking to them, and if we collect data, then they're building out our story of the change and proving it. If there are any questions as we go, please let me know. None so far, but feel free to write questions in the chat function as well. So what are the components of a good indicator? Each indicator's got 4 parts to it. It's got the population, the target, the threshold, and the timeline. But you can forget about the jargon. Simply, for each indicator, you want to ask who or what is changing. For example, parents spending time with their kids. Who's changing there? It's the kids that are changing. The parents might also be changing in their confidence, but it's for the benefit of the children that the change is happening. How many do we expect will succeed? How much is good enough? And by when does this outcome need to happen? So it's important to identify all of those things, because if you don't put a time frame on your indicator, you won't know how far back that you're seeking to measure it for. So if you were to say parents are doing this more, well, we don't know how long they've got to show that change. It could be that they weren't doing it more straight away afterwards, but 6 months, but actually we expect the change to happen 6 months later. So it's important for us to put that time frame on it.
Amy, so a question, do we usually, I guess it kind of comes down to the donor, whoever's funding, but is there an expectation that we need to get a sample size that's big enough to show statistical significance?
There isn't. It depends on who your audience is. So your audience might be a funder. They might require that you have it be statistically significant because they might be choosing to fund between you and another program, and they want to know that you're serving a sufficiently large portion of the population. Or it could be that your audience is the parents of the children, and so they just want to see what's happening, what change is happening for their children. They don't really care, that they know that you're only measuring 5 children and that 2 of them are their children. So the answer to that question is it depends on your audience. It also depends on, sometimes your audience is people who want stories. So they don't want it to be so robust as the equivalent of a randomized controlled trial. They want to know quickly what's happening. So fast data for them is better than long-term robust data. And any change gives them confidence that you're on the right track. So in that case, again, they don't mind how many it's showing change for, just to know that it is having some change. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so on the next slide there, where these are some other ways that you can think about what makes good quantitative indicators. So we think it's good to have a balance of qualitative and quantitative indicators. Here we're talking about the quantitative ones. So the things that you can count, it's not subjective, it's more objective. So some of the little tests we run over our indicators to see if they're good ones are whether it's valid. Can you accurately measure, is it an accurate measure of a behavior, a practice, a task that's expected, that is the expected output or outcome of the intervention? Is it reliable? Can you consistently measure that over time in the same way by different observers? Is it precise? Does it have clearly defined terms? Is it measurable? Is it something that's actually quantifiable using the available tools and measures? Or is it something that would overburden the organization, and meaning that it's too hard for them to measure, so they just wouldn't measure? Is it timely? Can they provide a measurement that, does it provide a measurement at time intervals that are relevant and appropriate in terms of the program's goals and activities? And is it relevant? Did I say that before, or timely? I'm not sure. Relevant is the last one there. Is it linked to the program or to achieving the program's objectives? So another little, for those of you who like acronyms, another way that people sometimes try to learn whether their indicators are good indicators is on the next slide there, thinking about whether they are SMART indicators. You might have heard that acronym before. Is it specific, measurable, achievable, reliable, and time-bound? I'm not a big fan of acronyms, but sometimes they can be helpful for remembering things. So are they SMART?
Hey, Clemmy, I see that both slides had reliable on it. Generally, is self-reported, like parents reporting how much time they spend reading to their kids? Is that generally reliable data, or does it change depending on how sensitive the question might be?
Good question, and you probably might have some thoughts on this as well, so feel free to share your thoughts. But again, I'll come back to that thing of whether it's who the audience is. So if your objective is to get quick insights, asking the parents how often they're reading to their children, that might be a clue that the parents are reading to their children more, but it also, you might use that as a clue that the parents acknowledge the importance of reading to their children. So whether they're telling the truth or not, the fact that they've upped the number shows that they think it's important. So you can kind of build into what you anticipate the answer to be, but depending on how reliable you need it to be, you can protect for that in what you're actually hoping to extract from the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And in my own experience, especially working in sexual and reproductive health, some of the questions are really quite sensitive. So often we sort of correlate it next to other indicators that are measuring the same thing in slightly different ways, just to be sure that the data we're getting is reliable. But that said, I have to say, most of my experience, I think self-reported data has been quite reliable if you ask the question well, which I know you're going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah. There's a certain level of trust that you can build if you ask the question well, and if you build in like protections around anonymity and making so that people don't feel like it will be their data that's reported to the world. Yeah, often, and also if you kind of cultivate a relationship of we're in this together, and we're trying to achieve outcomes with you and for you, then that reduces the likelihood that the reporter will report incorrectly because they're invested in the outcomes being positive. And if they're not, if they haven't shown any change, hopefully if you've taken a strengths-based approach, they won't be constantly blaming themselves. They'll be wanting to see positive change, but not blaming themselves and wanting to correct for that. So we've talked about quantitative indicators. We think it's really important to also include qualitative indicators, particularly since a lot of the organizations we expect you're working with are startups, early stage, smaller organizations. They're doing innovative things. They probably want to learn quickly and be able to tell stories effectively. And the qualitative indicators allow you to capture those stories that you wouldn't anticipate necessarily, that you wouldn't know to ask the question for. So sometimes there are no numbers you can collect as well, and that's why you need to use qualitative indicators. You just have to ask people the question of how they're feeling about it or how change happened for them, because there's no hard number that could tell you about that change. Sometimes you have to rely on stories, but also sometimes you want to rely on stories because that's where sometimes the richness comes through. So the problem with qualitative indicators is that they're harder to compare. It's harder to show change over time, but they do give you a lot more richness than what numbers can. So that's why we recommend having both. So on that last slide in the indicators section there, we're just referring you to the fact that there are a lot of indicator libraries out there. There are lots of places where people have listed down ways that they are measuring certain changes. that won't necessarily be perfect for your circumstances or the organization and the community that they're working in, but it can be a starting point. Some of them have been validated. So they've used evidence, they're statistically validated. So if your audience is a funder that requires things to be more robust, then it could be good for you to seek out those validated indicators to try and add some rigor to what you're testing. But also I think it's just a really good starting point to help you think of some alternative ways of measuring, of capturing things that you hadn't thought of necessarily before. So one of them there, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, is the SDGs. The SDGs have those high level 17 goals, but sitting underneath those 17 goals, there are indicators for how they are measuring that change. So that's quite a good source of indicators. And then lots of governments and departments have their own indicator libraries or are developing them. So here in New Zealand, we've got Statistics New Zealand have developed a library called Indicators Aotearoa, which is about to go live, and it's about to be a centralized source of data, of all of the data that the government captures against those indicators that New Zealanders have said matter to them. So it's quite an interesting data set that won't specifically be relevant to your country, but if in your country it's hard for you to find them, you might want to look at that New Zealand one, because it's got some alternative measures that aren't the classic things that governments normally measure. As a consequence, about 30% of those indicators they don't have any data for, but that's okay because they are recognizing that they're going to have to try and start gathering that data, because those are the things that matter to people. Those are just two of the indicator libraries. There are a lot of them around. So you shouldn't be stuck thinking, how on earth would I ever measure that thing? It seems unmeasurable. There are different ways that you can measure things. So today we were talking about how would we measure Māori involvement. So that's the Indigenous people of New Zealand, their involvement in economic development. And the way we decided to measure it was thinking about the numbers of policies or plans that relate to the economy that have been developed with engagement with Māori leaders. So it's quite random, and you can be quite creative in the ways you measure different things, as long as you think it would tell the true story of the change that you expect to see. Nicola, have you got any questions, or has anyone else got any questions about indicators before we talk about how you start to gather some of these things?
No, I don't have any questions. I think these are really good resources, these two places. And like you said, behind those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there's a whole database of potential indicators, and a lot of them are quite high level, but even if your indicators to contribute towards those, they've got some really good language and ideas to get you started.
Yeah. And you've now got your friends from this forum that maybe you can share some thoughts with and try and learn together. Okay, so I'll move on to how you gather things, but if you've got any questions as we keep going about questions about an indicator or how you would measure a certain thing, feel free to ask it. There might be something from the theories of change that you've seen through this work where there's an outcome in there that seems just far too hard to ever measure. I might not have the answer, but feel free to challenge me. Okay, so approaches to data gathering. So you've got your clear logic from your theory of change, and what we're trying to say here is that data collection doesn't have to be overwhelming. You've got your clear logic, and with some evidence, including simple things like changes that you observe, a simple survey of the stakeholders, and maybe some existing data you already capture, like the number of people that turn up to a session, or the number of people that buy your just your recyclable cups. You've already got quite a lot of evidence there. So packaging those things together, you're a long way along to being able to tell the story of change that's been created. So the survey, so there we've just mentioned a few things. The observing changes, and I mentioned that with reference to facilitators of the parenting program. People who are your staff, your volunteers, yourself, can observe changes in how the customers behave or how the people that you're seeking to benefit change. It doesn't seem robust, but if you start to do a count of those things, it can start to become more valid. So it's about having the right categories so that you can start to count those things. And that's the least invasive thing that you can do. So I always suggest to consider observable changes first when you're thinking about how you can measure things, because it doesn't take resource, it's not intrusive on other people, and over time it can become statistically relevant. So we've just got a question there from Rita. It seems very high level data. We're at the base of the pyramid level, so it's good to exchange with other participants. I think, Rita, there you're probably talking, correct me if I'm wrong, but you might be talking about the SDG indicators. I agree that they're very high level. And so they're measuring, have you solved world hunger? And what are the indicators for that? And that's the stuff that you might have at the end of your theory of change, maybe, even if your program goes anywhere near that. You're wondering how you can measure the early stage outcomes. In the assignment, I've referred you to another indicator library that is from New South Wales. It's called the Human Services Outcomes Framework Primary Indicator Library. And included in that, it's got lead indicators and lag indicators. The lead indicators are ones that are early stage indicators that suggest that they're on track to achieving those longer term outcomes. It might be, you might find more of the indicators you're looking for in that lead box compared to the lag ones, which are the later stage ones. I'll just type that in the box for everyone. Okay. So look, listen, and use what you've already got. The next thing that can help you use what you've got is surveying stakeholders. So if you can't see the change yourself, a survey of a sample of stakeholders can deliver really useful qualitative insights and quantitative insights if you're asking them to report on the number of times they do things. It's valuable to ask standard questions and some open questions to make sure you keep learning. We'll talk later on about how you ask questions, but I recommend including an open-ended one so that people know, so that you gather things that you didn't already know and help to challenge the logic in your theory of change. Otherwise, you just might be collecting mutual, reinforcing your own ideas. And also consider the data you've already got. So, like I said, the foot traffic on your website, the number of people that come into your store, those sorts of things, that the number of solar lanterns or clean cook stoves that are sold, number of customers that give you insights. Those things are also relatively easy to count, but if you think about it creatively, they might be telling you some interesting stories about the change that's happening. So we'll dive into some of those data collection methods a little bit deeper. First up, we've got text message surveys. So we're seeing these be used, they're a relatively cost-effective way of doing a survey of a lot of people. So Some of the organizations you work with probably will be too small for this to be relevant, but if you're, say, working in a developing country and you've got a big community that you're trying to survey, this one's quite good. So it's good for lower tech environments where beneficiaries, the people who are you're trying to benefit, might not have access to a computer. They're fast and effective, cheap to run. They work best for simple questions where you're not asking for a lot of detail. You're just asking for things like how many hours did you spend reading to your kids? But you're not asking those qualitative questions where you're wanting people to give full answers, because obviously texting, that's a real pain. And also they generally have capacity for people to respond yes or no or a number or things like that. So they don't give you that deep understanding, but they're quick and they're quick and reach a lot of people.
Hey, Clemmy, just an observation I've had of trying this in many different countries is two barriers. I love this approach, but two things to keep in mind. One is in a lot of countries, SMSing or texting, depending on which slang you use, isn't always free. So sometimes if people have to pay to hit reply, that can be a deterrent. And the other thing too is looking at even cell phone coverage, and even if there is coverage, sometimes, especially if you're trying to reach women, they don't always have their own phones, and I know this from working with prenatal messaging, and sometimes the message ends up going to their partner or husband who gets the message. So it's a great method, but sometimes we have to really think about the context to whether you're going to reach the people you most want to reach, and whether if there's money involved, they'll be able to actually respond.
Good points. Thanks, Nicola. So next method there, interactive voice response. This is getting even more tech. I haven't used this one, but people say it's great. So it's a technology where it calls people up and asks them the question. It's like a little robot that asks people the question and gathers their information and then responds based on their responses. Nicola, have you ever used this one?
No, I haven't.
I feel like it lacks that kind of connection bit, but I'm putting it in here because some people swear by it and say that it's easy and great to get a whole lot of data. I normally play at the end of let's get data from fewer people but rich data that doesn't burden your volunteers or staff too much. Other people like to go broad and get a lot of data from a lot of people. Depends on what the organisation is as well.
And I also wonder with this one, Clemmy, too, whether there's an opportunity to choose a language, because that was one of the other challenges we had with the text messaging, is in a lot of countries I've worked in, there are a multitude of languages used, and trying to reach the right people with their own language can also be a challenge. So maybe this one gives you the opportunity to sort of opt in on what language is right for you.
Yeah, that's good. And if your interviewers don't have the capacity to do that, then that can overcome that barrier. Great. So the online survey is the next one. This is, I think the online survey is quite good. You can use whatever platform your audience uses the most. So Facebook is increasingly becoming popular. Facebook surveys are quite easy to set up and run. It does assume that the recipient has a computer or a phone capable of doing their survey. You can get more in-depth responses than with the text or the interactive voice thing. It's still impersonal, but sometimes that's good depending on the context. If you're asking quite sensitive things, or if you're asking questions where you think people will want to have the time to respond in their own time, then it can suit those needs as well. So outside of Facebook, there's other things like SurveyMonkey and lots of free tools that can help you do online surveys quite easily and cheaply. And you can send the link via email. You can send people, you can direct people to a website, and you can often, I'll often use an online survey and pair it with a paper survey. So if there are some groups that you know won't be able to get to a website, then you can work one-on-one with them in paper form, or an interview. But then for all of the others, you can use that online survey.
Lemmy, when you've used the online versus the paper, the people essentially self-select to actually respond. So you probably, I'd be curious to see whether you did that versus a paper where you just randomly selected, whether you got very similar results, or whether the self-selected people who opted in to do the online survey answered slightly differently than the rest. Do you have any knowledge or insights on that in terms of response bias?
Yeah, normally well, I'm thinking of a couple of instances where it's sort of balanced out, because the people who didn't do the online one had literacy challenges, and so they had an interview. You would expect from having an interview that you would get a fuller response, but because of their literacy challenges, they also were a bit embarrassed to fully answer the questions. So the responses weren't as full as we might have expected. So that counted it out a little bit. But I think it's in all of the instances I can think of, it was a necessary thing to give people the option of privacy, and also give people the option to answer if literacy was a barrier or if language was a barrier. So it was just providing multiple options so that every person was able to have their voice heard, regardless of what their barrier was. Okay, so face-to-face interview. Face-to-face interview is obviously a lot deeper, the responses that you can get, but it's much more labor intensive for you and your team to go find people, sit down, have the time. It might be that you've got female interviewers, but it's male participants who don't want to speak to a female person, or there are just time barriers getting people organized and getting in front of enough people. It can be quite informal and casual. So a face-to-face interview doesn't need to be a sit down for an hour asking a million questions. It could just be that you ask one question every time someone buys a cup of coffee with your recyclable cup, saying, is this the same cup you brought in last time, or something. So that can be considered a face-to-face interview, and it's really not labor intensive and is much more appropriate than asking someone to go onto a website or putting a survey in front of them. So yeah, don't discount the option of face-to-face interview if because there are these different forms that it can take. It's also great for collecting stories, obviously. And sometimes, depending on the context, it's great to just have a recorder and put that face down on the table and record the story so that you've captured that in real time, and you could play it back later. You might even have an audience today in the world where everyone has given up any shred of privacy concerns, it seems, in some contexts, young people in particular. They might welcome the opportunity to share their thoughts and have it be recorded, and that's quite gold dust like if you can play back a fantastic quote to a potential investor or funder. So yeah, consider that as an option as well. It also lets you follow the conversation and get deeper insight. So if you get back an answer that you didn't necessarily expect, you can, if the interviewer is prepped correctly and feels comfortable enough, they could follow that lead and try and learn more about what the person had said. Focus groups, so face-to-face interviews in group form, pretty much. Allows you to gather insights from lots of people at once. Sometimes people feel more comfortable in that context because they're not, it's not as intimidating being one-on-one with a person, or they can kind of build on each other's ideas when they hear other great ideas that other people are sharing. It's better for gathering those qualitative things than quantitative. Sometimes you can have a combination of a focus group and a paper survey. So at the end of it, you ask people to fill out the quantitative stuff, but you've gathered the qualitative stuff through the survey. And on to observations. We talked about just watching what's happening without it sounding too voyeuristic, but watching how many, like, do people look happy when they buy that disposable cup? Are the children concentrating in class? All sorts of things that the people who are already being paid or already volunteering to be in front of a group of people might be able to observe in the work that they're doing, and all they need is the right input to be able to record it at the end of the day. So that could be as simple as a bit of paper with the right headings for them to tick a box at the end of every day for what they've seen. So it works well when there's change that's not happening in people as well, such as environmental change. So obviously you can't ask the environment how it's feeling. You'll need to be observing that change and measuring it as you go. Internal systems. So check out what you've got already that you hadn't thought of. Are there chat functions on your website? Are there have you got great data on the number of times people buy things? If you've got repeat customers, if you've got comment boxes after people have bought something on your online store where they've said why they liked the product. Is there data that you're already collecting because you have to report to a particular funder or investor or customer? And it's better to use that data because you know you'll have to keep collecting it for that funder and repurpose it for your own recording rather than collecting something similar but slightly different that creates more data collection burden. So it's efficient because it doesn't require extra work, but generally this kind of data is output data repurposed as outcomes data. So even though it can be tempting when you see all of that data to use it all, make sure you use your discretion and only use data that actually tells you about change in an outcome. And external data sources. So this is data that someone else is collecting that you can get hold of. So you might choose to use population level data as a baseline so that you can show change against other data. It might be that you're working with a group of kids that are in a school, so the school's already collecting data about them. It could be that you're working in a community and there's some other community service provider or charity or NGO working in that community and they're collecting something. So it could be that, off the top of my head, I won't think of a good analogy, but you're selling cook stoves in a community, someone else is providing free meals in that community. You might see that the work that you're doing mutually benefits the other work, or when certain families take up one offering, they don't need the other one as much. That's interesting data to compare to see the impact that you're having versus the other organisation. So have a look around and see what data is available already. The advantages of that is it's easy and cost effective and it's unobtrusive. You're not asking people to spend their time. It's credible and it's data on the quantity or the frequency as well. Disadvantages is it can be a scramble trying to get hold of it. Sometimes those other people that are collecting data don't want to share it with you. And sometimes it's too complicated. It can require complex analysis that you might not have the resources to be able to do. Reviewing it can be time consuming, it might be incomplete, it might have like problems with the data where the same thing's entered twice, or a word is entered slightly differently in two places, so it could be messy data. So don't go down the black hole of being tempted by a lot of data because it looks exciting that there's a lot of data, but spending too much time on it when actually it isn't serving your purposes. So beware the pitfalls of too much data.
Thanks, Clemmy. I think one of the things I found, and again, it changed country to country and context, is not being not having the confidence in how the quality of the data. Like you said, data could be missing, it could be double reported, but sometimes if you don't have access to the raw data set, you really can't be 100% confident all the time that the data is actually reliable. And I guess that just really depends on your context and who's actually collecting it, how they're collecting it, how they're cleaning it, how they're storing it, and how they're analysing it.
Yeah. Yeah, be careful. Your own data will probably be cleaner, or at least it will be after you've set up fantastic systems. And when I say your own, I mean the ventures that you're working with. Okay, also just think about whether your venture can measure what would have happened without them. This is really hard sometimes. In our second session, we talked about how it's important to consider what would have happened without the work your venture's doing. Would things have improved anyway due to other factors, like with those people that self-selected into the ventures program, the ones that were already going to be upwardly mobile because they were the go-getters, and have they just selected the best participants that would have succeeded anyway? So is there a way they can measure that effect with a control group? Control group being a group of people that have similar characteristics to the people you're working with but don't receive your support. That's often expensive. So I would say, again, here, think about who your audience is. Will your audience need that? Do you need that to learn whether what you're doing is working or not? If you've got the funding, if you've got the resources to be able to do it, that's great. But just be aware it's expensive, and you do need to pick people with very similar characteristics, which can be quite time consuming and also ethically challenging. If you find people with really similar characteristics that would really benefit from your program, it's difficult to not offer what you're offering if you think it's a great offering to those people. But if you can't get a control group, a baseline before and after what you do, so a baseline assessment, measuring where your group's at before and afterwards, that can still help to attribute impact to your work. You can also ask your customers about the impact of your product or service during surveys, and also ask whether there are other factors that influence the change that they experienced. So even if you can't observe it, it's not as reliable, but you can ask them, did this program have that benefit on you? And what else contributed to the change for you? Any questions?
No questions, Clem. I just think reiterating what you were saying about control groups. The few times I've used them, it's either been a massive study that's likely to get published in a national or international journal, and they're trying to prove something, statistically significant, or it's been associated with a really academic piece of research where maybe a university's been involved, and they just need to show that, show the relevance of the change. So I guess what you're saying is, think twice before doing a controlled group. If you don't need to do it, don't do it. And like you said, there's often a lot of ethical considerations around it as well.
Yeah. I've never needed to use a control group with a social enterprise. I think you're right, Nicola. It's only those more intensive kinds of evaluations that use them. A simple before and after survey does give you useful insights. Okay, so part 3, the lean data approach. So we're borrowing some of the language here from Acumen, which is another great source of information about how to do impact measurement. And we'll just share with you some thoughts on good practice around how to collect data in a way that's sensitive to your communities that you're working in, and gets good, quick insights. So what is lean data? Lean data asks you to see the customer as being primary. Customers first. That's the idea that you're collecting data to create additional value for your customers and clients. You're collecting their feedback and analyzing that data frequently to allow you to implement changes faster and keep your customers or the people you're trying to benefit engaged. It also means you can adjust your support or the services better to positively meet those people's needs. So it's really taking a partnership approach and seeing those people as key stakeholders who you're working alongside. So you're trying to learn from them as you go, what works, what's not working, how you can adjust, but keeping the customer primary. The next core thing about lean data is for it to be low cost. Use low cost technology. The idea that you can collect useful data using low tech and low cost technology just as effectively often as some of the expensive platforms that require you to pay a lot of money every week. So, for example, those free online survey generators and text surveys are the cheaper option than a research program. It's in that way, it's good for social enterprises who are usually strapped for cash or startups. The third principle there is to be decision driven. And that's the idea that you can collect feedback at multiple continuous stages so that you can rapidly inform decisions. So you're collecting data to make decisions, not to do a final evaluation. If you take the parenting program, if you waited until you got the before school check, you wouldn't have any insights for 5 years. So that's 5 years that you haven't been able to improve your program as you went, learn whether what you were doing was working or not, and benefit the customers by using those insights to improve. Any thoughts on whether these sound like good principles? Challenges?
I think these are great principles, Clemmy. I think one observation on decision driven, I like your point about getting the information at the time when you need to make decisions. I think one other piece of advice I have on decision driven is asking yourself if you really need that data. I know I have a tendency when I start designing a questionnaire to ask just a couple more questions because I'm kind of curious, and it's stuff I'd like to know and don't necessarily need to know. And I have to remind myself, if I want to be lean, to keep things, to really only ask questions that are essential and are going to influence decision making versus I'm kind of curious and it would be kind of nice to know. And sometimes it's a bit of a grey area.
Yeah, once you get excited about data, it can be addictive. You just want more.
Well, yeah, that's it. You kind of think, oh, just one more, just one more.
Okay, so on that next slide, why is lean data a useful method?
Oh, just a second, did you see you've got a comment from Rita?
Oh, thank you, Rita. So we find we get good and bad decisions from members. We feel bad when recommendations are not adopted. Yeah, okay, so yeah, you want to be customer first and get their insights, but sometimes they ask for things that aren't possible to give. Yeah, that's probably quite common. I'm sure a lot of people experience that. And you've probably got your own ways of coping with that. Hopefully over time, that partnership approach, they can see what you are doing and it's just about open communication. But I hear you that sometimes you don't want to be too open-ended and just promising the world. So I guess it's limiting the scope, asking what they want within a scope. Good point though. Okay, so why is lean data a useful method? We think it makes you just ask for the relevant information, as you were saying, Nicola. It's not asking every question that may be relevant. Only the ones that give you the information that you need. So you ask fewer questions, it's faster, it prevents survey fatigue in your customers, and it's cheaper to analyze as well. You don't get a heap of data in from your surveying as well that you then have to crunch. It also means you're respecting your customers' time, and knowing that they've got their own things going on, so you don't bombard them with long-term commitments to your data gathering. Lots of social enterprises that we work with don't have the funding to spend much on in-depth and long-winded research, so lean data is useful to get the more usable results for less money. Often they're trying to get quick insights to help them communicate with their customers and show them that they're having impact, check that what they're doing is working quickly. They don't need it to be really heavy, statistically relevant data that will prove beyond shadow of a doubt that they're having impact. They're just wanting the quick insights for cheap. So it's fast, you only collect the relevant data, respects your customers, it improves your decision making, and it's cheaper. And the core principles of lean data, it nurtures this habit of listening to customers in order to provide actionable insights on their needs and interests. We think that it gives you data it's of sufficient quality to support decision making. It's not always statistically relevant, but we think it's more important that it's good for decision making than academic level reporting. It allows for learning, adaptation, and replication, uses low-cost tools and technologies, enables rapid data collection in a fast-changing environment. So it comes from the bottom up. As you were saying, Rita, it's not at the level of the SDGs, high level, it's bottom up. It's useful, iterative, light touch, and dynamic. Any other comments or thoughts?
I love this research approach. I used to joke to myself and say it was my quick and dirty research, but I found it was just like you said, it was quick, it was efficient, it was really insightful. You got information quickly, you could make decisions quickly that you felt confident in. And I have to say, yeah, it's one of my preferred methods for the right circumstances. It's really helpful. And like you said, also usually very cheap.
Yeah. And I think it really shifts the focus away from where research has played for a lot of years of being the realm of academics to making it something everyone can do. And it focuses on what really matters, which is learning and making decisions. And it puts those, I think, are the most important things, but it's nice that it also puts you in a good position for telling clear, effective stories of the change that you're having. So just some other decisions, some other considerations with data gathering. Think about the speed. How often are you going to need to collect data, and how much time will it take those people to participate? Think about the resources that you'll need. The more time you put into data collection, the more it costs the organization and the less likely it is to happen. So you need to find that sweet spot between it's not taking too much time and so we're going to do it, but it's still useful data. So you need to find that right balance between enough and not overdoing it. Think about what stage you're going to do it at. So different outcomes happen at different stages. Some of them you'll have to wait a longer time for, and it's great if you can to maintain relationships with people who have interacted with your organization so you can ask them about change that's happened longer down the line. So think about which level of data is going to be most useful for you to measure and improve and communicate your impact at which point. Think about rigor. So your data needs to be robust enough and stand up to being looked at closely. It needs to be supported, but like with your resources, don't overdo it. It needs to be fit for purpose. Think about your funders, your stakeholders, your customers, understand what depth they need you to go into. What does your audience want? And think about the level of impact. How big do you want to go? There's a risk that if you go too big, you'll overclaim your impact, and you'll be claiming things that actually it's others that did, not you. And on to some other quick guidelines. you can check for statistical significance, and you can also survey non-customers too. So think about how many people you need to survey to get those reliable results. The size of the sample required to achieve statistical significance can vary depending on the complexity of your study and the population size. You might want to seek expert advice if needed. Probably not though, that's probably overcooking it for a social enterprise. If you need it to be statistically relevant, then a general rule for most simple surveys is a sample size of 200. But again, with social enterprises, that can be far too many. You might just be wanting the insights to learn what's happening, and it can be that 10 to 20 people is enough to know what's happening, to make decisions. So on the, yes, you can also survey non-customers to see if they've heard of your product or your service, or they've thought about purchasing it. If not, why not? What's stopping them? Yeah, so sometimes those non-customers can give you useful insights as well.
Yeah, Clemmy, I've done a lot of work with surveying non-customers and found it can be incredibly useful, especially if you've got a marketing plan or and specifically a sort of a customer profile. And these are people who have an unmet need or have a problem, and you have a solution for their problem, and they're looking for a solution, and yet they're still not engaging with you. Either they're not buying your product or your service. And I have found just a wealth of information trying to work out what is the barrier that's getting them from potentially being a customer. So really valuable data can be had as long as you're asking the right people, i.e. they should be customers, but for some reason they're not.
Yeah, cool. Any other thoughts or questions? Or before we move on to part 4, any thoughts on gathering data? No, cool. So creating your survey questions. We're going to quickly talk through some best practice ways of designing your survey. If surveying is the way you're choosing to go, but this can also be relevant to thinking about interview questions or whichever format you use. So firstly, setting up. Decide what you want to know and why. Create a clear hypothesis. Keep your eye on the decisions you'll make. So think it through, like what data is going to come back from those questions that you're asking. Make sure your questions are relevant and actionable. What will you do with the information you expect to collect? Be ruthless in culling any questions that don't immediately help you to make decisions. Remember that what people say they'll do and what they actually do are often different. So make sure you collect data on past actions, not predictions. Not have you changed, and do you think you will do things differently because of changing? Wait the time and then catch up with them in a couple of months' time and ask them if they've done it. Be clear on who you want to take your survey. Who's your target customer and what language will they speak? What might their prior experiences be with surveys? We've found it's always worth introducing yourself and the purpose of the survey at the start. Be respectful of people's time and information. So also it's not always practical to reward people in any way, but we think it's important just to remember, and you can remind social enterprises this, that often they are getting paid for their time when they're doing the surveying, but the person who's responding to the survey isn't. So be respectful of the fact that they have information that you want and value, and you're asking them to do something for free. Even if it is to benefit them, it's still important to recognize that. Others might have thoughts on that, but particularly in New Zealand and Australia, we're finding that our Indigenous populations are being over-surveyed because all of these service providers are using them. and we have to be really careful about how we use their time. So, oh, sorry, I've just lost my spot. Yeah, and remember that less is more. People have found over and over and over again that asking fewer questions is better. So if you're using more than 5 to 7 questions, there's a steady decline in the response rates. So you want it to take people less than 10 minutes generally. If you really do need to ask a lot of questions, instead of doing it all in one blast, try and break it up and ask a couple of surveys in different batches. There's a nice quote from Tom Adams from Acumen's Director of Lean Data. He says, it's better to have a few questions answered well than a survey where people end up exhausted by the end and are trying to get through the questions as quickly as possible. And if that happens, you kind of can get quite dirty data and you can't really trust it. So be careful to make sure that all of the responses people have been thoughtful in their responses, and fewer questions help with that. So make your survey ethical and enjoyable. So on the next slide, we're thinking about how you can frame your questions. People respond well to open-ended questions. They feel listened to, and the quality of their responses is higher than one might typically expect. We think it's good to mix up qualitative and quantitative questions. We've talked about including both of those and why to do that. But remember that qualitative evidence is open-ended, and so it can take longer to ask the question. So make sure you're not going too far past that 10-minute mark if you're asking too many qualitative questions. And avoid brain pain. Use plain language. Think about your audience and what their barriers they might face to being able to answer your survey. Are there language barriers? Are there literacy barriers? Are there other technology barriers, cost barriers? And don't ask complex questions that respondents can't understand. So a good way to check this is to ask a friend the same survey questions, hopefully someone who doesn't work in your industry. Run it past a family member or someone first. If they're confused or find it difficult to answer, try rewording it so it's completely plain language. This sounds obvious and easy, but those of us who try desperately to use plain language and do this exercise of asking other people first often get caught out. So I really encourage you to do that. It happens to the best of us that we slot in a difficult word, or a word that has split meanings, or a jargon word that we've become so accustomed to using that we accidentally use it. So here's a couple of examples. You should avoid a question like, what was the state of cleanliness in the hospital room? And instead ask, how clean was your room? Avoid, do you possess bovine livestock? I'm pretty sure no one would ask that question, but it highlights the point. Instead, you could say, do you own a cow? So the first one there is an open-ended question, and the second one is plain language. Okay, so more about framing your questions there. Avoid asking loaded questions. Don't put your own values or assumptions in there. Don't let them creep in. Don't ask double-barreled questions. I like that little picture with the 2 barrels. Make sure you're only asking one question at a time. And we've said before about the qualitative questions being able to yield quick results, but make sure they're not so broad that it chews up all your time. Remember what you're trying to do is put the organisation in a position where they can inform their decision making. So here's a couple more examples. Avoid the question of, in the past week, how much money did you waste on cigarettes? So we've got the word waste in there, which is quite judgment based. Instead, you could ask, in the past week, how much money did you spend on cigarettes? Avoid saying, do you read and sing to your kids every day? Instead ask, do you read to your kids every day? So just asking one of those things. Avoid asking, what do you think of our cook stoves? Instead ask, what's the most useful feature of our cook stoves? So that third one there, it's more specific. You're not having it be too open-ended. I often find also, if it's too open-ended, when I've done interviews with people and it's too open-ended, sometimes that's even more confusing because they're not sure what direction you want them to go in, what kind of information they want back, and that can lead people astray. We've just got a couple here of quite common questions, not necessarily from the social sector or social enterprise world, but I find this one useful, this Net Promoter Score. It's often used by businesses to ask their customers how much they value them, and a good way of asking that is if you would refer someone else to them. It measures the customer experience and predicts the business growth as a consequence. It was developed by Bain to assess, and it's just got this 0 to 10 scale, so it's really easy. But I find it's also useful for knowing whether your customers or your users of a service value the service as well. It's just one simple question, but it's a pretty powerful tool to measure customer service satisfaction. So I recommend keeping that one in your back pocket. And here's another similar, the customer effort score is another similar one that with just a couple of questions, it's quite a powerful measure of customer service satisfaction. And the underlying assumption behind this one is that companies create loyal customers by reducing customer effort. So if they're asked, have you experienced any challenges using this product or service? And if they haven't, then that suggests that it was easier for them to use the product and more enjoyable. So it tracks how hard it is for the customer to receive support on their issues that they present to the company. Okay, so just a couple more survey design tips there. Remember to have consistent scales. That helps for comparing. It's also easier for the person when they're trying to answer the questions. That flows through nicely. Ask demographic questions up top, so or at the end, but just make sure you ask those so that you can go back and say, oh, the under 15s love our product, but the over 45-year-olds really aren't into recyclable cups. You can only know that if you've asked people their age at the start. You might have a program that's rolled out across a whole district, but you want to know which store within that district is being most effective. So you need to ask geographic information of the customers to know, to be able to gather that data. So by asking a few demographic questions, suddenly your data is much more useful. Date the survey so that you can show change over time. That's a simple, easy one that people often forget. And just remember again, aim for under 10 questions, under 7 if you can, but certainly under 10. Okay, so now we've moved our way further around the theory of change process. On from the theory of change, we've got to the indicators, identifying indicators and gathering data. So we're almost all red around the circle. And in the next session, we'll talk about how you can store, analyze, report. We'll talk about some tools you can use to do this stuff and how you can use those tools to generate insights to learn from. We'll also talk about communicating, how you can package all of this up and tell compelling stories of change to your stakeholders. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
Yeah, Clemmy, a few slides back, you had the 10-point scale. Do you have any sort of advice or insights on when to use like a 5 or 7-point scale? How to decide how many points to be on the from the agree to, you know, strongly disagree to the strongly agree?
Yeah, so that 10-point scale on the Net Promoter Score, definitely use the 10 points for that one, because that's a validated score that is used consistently around the world. So don't muddle with that one if you want to be able to compare with other businesses. But for other questions, you can choose your own score. So depending on your audience, depending on the people who are going to be filling out your surveys, if you think you've got a lot of fence sitters, so people who are likely to just go through and say middle of the road, middle of the road, middle of the road for all of them, but you might want to have a scale that doesn't have a midpoint. So you could have a scale from 1 to 4, for example. So then people have to choose a 2 or a 3. They can't say that it was just in the middle. Rita said that she likes the smiling, sad, or angry emoji for assessment. Yeah, that's another great one, and that is great also for interviews with people who struggle with literacy. So you could give them the smiley face, read the question out to them, and then they tick which smiley face box they like. Just a qualifier there that I've been told that in the mental health space, some of them don't like using the smiley face because it suggests that happy is good and sad is bad. So that's just a slight qualifier there. But other than that, yeah, I really like that smiling, sad, or angry face emoji. But yeah, I think 10-point scale is quite long to only use it for the Net Promoter Score. Otherwise, I'd say use a 5 or a 7-point scale. Great, thanks for that, Rita and Nicola. Any other comments? Okay,
I'm just opening up the assignment. And is that coming up on the screen?
It is, yeah. So we've got the assignment here that we'll share with all of the group, not just those who've come along. But Nicola, do you want to talk through the assignment, or I can?
Could you do it? I'm just having some technical issues.
Sure. So for this assignment, we just directed you to a couple of other web resources there for you to have a browse through. In the webinar, we mentioned the SDGs and the New Zealand indicators Aotearoa, but here we've got that New South Wales one that I mentioned, and also IRIS metrics. So just go into that and have a look around. You don't have to do anything, just have a look and see if there are any indicators in there that you'd find useful in your work. And then the assignment is to go in and use this template, which Nicola's opening, and it's got some outcomes in there. You can either choose those outcomes or choose your own outcomes, and just have a go at thinking about what a good indicator would be for those outcomes. Just have a crack. Don't worry about it being perfect. In the seminar, we'll talk about what some other ideas for some indicators, or you can share the ones that you've done. So I would encourage you to complete the indicators and also the data source. Don't worry about filling out the whole table unless you want to, but we encourage you to complete columns B and E to fill out what an indicator might be for those outcomes, and where you could capture data about that indicator. So that's what we've run through today, talking about how to select indicators and how you can capture data. If you want to keep going, you can think about survey questions, and you can write the survey questions in there as well. But it's a pretty, hopefully the assignment won't take too much time this week. So have a go.
And as Clemmy said, if you want to make it more directly relevant, don't use those outcomes we've pre-populated. Take those out and actually put some in there that are really useful to you. And then we can talk about them at the seminar.
Great. Thanks, Nicola, and thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Clemmy. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.